We are recording now, and I will make this go away. Awesome. Okay, so welcome to the to panel 2, Political Killing in Cyprus. And we will have a musical extravaganza ahead of us. So I'd like to introduce Andrakos Varnava in the room and Mike Haji Michael on Zoom, presenting on colonialism, EOKA, and ochlocracy in British Cyprus, the mob killing of Savas Menikos in 1958. Over to you, Andrakos.
Thank you, Sasha, and thanks for being here. So yes, we're tag teaming. Let me get this. Okay, so yeah, you know the title. You will see a photo of this gentleman, who is the gentleman that is the subject of our paper, but we are giving a broader understanding of his murder, which occurred in 1958. But that's a photo of him. You can see who it is. So on the 23rd of May, 1958, EOKA was a terrorist group trying to achieve the union of Cyprus with Greece between 1955 and 59. It was a Greek Cypriot right-wing organization. So an EOKA-inspired mob, including children, killed Savas Menikos at Lefkoniko, which was a township in the Famagusta district in Cyprus, in what the coroner labeled as animalistic. Tied to a eucalyptus tree in the churchyard of the township, Menikos was stoned, beaten, suffocated, and some even claimed urinated on in front of leading elders, including a priest and a teacher. Beyond the initial inquest, the British colonial authorities and those of the Republic, which formed in 1960 upon independence, have never investigated this horrific killing. Why was this the only case of an EOKA political murder by ochlocracy? By a mob, in other words. EOKA was a far right-wing terrorist organization that deployed brutal methods to coerce Greek Cypriots into supporting its method of an armed struggle to achieve enosis, killing more Greek Cypriots than British and Turkish Cypriots put together. The historiography is practically non-existent on EOKA political killings, and on this specific case, though, there have been several fictional accounts, which we will discuss, reflecting that there is a fear to openly discuss it. This article reconstructs this murder using official and unofficial sources, fictional accounts, and the wider context in order to answer whether it was the only why was it the only example of a mob killing in the name of EOKA? So what I want to do now is unusual, but I think it warrants me to introduce briefly Mike, because we're going to play his song in a moment. Now, Mike has, in some respects, I think, in a way we could say, a sort of double life, leading the life of an academic as a professor of communications, in which he was head of the school or head of the department, whatever it's called over there at the University of Nicosia, publishing, teaching, doing everything that academics do. And he has just retired, and I'll come back to that, while also being a professional musician, a recording artist, having recorded albums and so forth. He's very well known as a reggae artist and has actually written a book on Bob Marley, but also he has other musical interests. And what we're going to hear now is a song. So the plan was that he would be here to perform it live for us. It didn't work out. But what he did was he performed it live at this was a retirement function, let's call it.
It was a book launch.
Book launch. It was
Yeah.
a book launch. And the song, The Eucalyptus Tree, was performed by Mike there. How do I brought that back, but I wanted to come to this to play the song now.
So this one is called The Eucalyptus Tree. whole village knew what they did, and no one uttered a word. How could they? With guns pointed in their faces from all directions. They tied an innocent man to a eucalyptus tree. Tied an innocent man to a eucalyptus tree. The murderers never slept again. They were haunted by their twisted memories. Restless, irritated souls, lost in a life of guilt. They beat an innocent man on the eucalyptus tree. They beat an innocent man on the eucalyptus tree. 6 fatherless children and a widow left to fend all by herself. Orphans of a working man who did nothing wrong but speak out. They killed an innocent man on the eucalyptus tree. They killed an innocent man on the eucalyptus tree. Walked away scot-free. Hypocrisy for all to see. A killing by a mob, totally animalistic. They killed an innocent man on the eucalyptus tree. Murdered an innocent man on the eucalyptus tree. Liar, 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 lie, 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 lie. Liar, 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 lie. Many go, many go. Many goes, many goes, many goes.
Okay, so Mike is now going to speak briefly about the making of the song.
Thank you.
All right, mate?
Yeah, so the killing of Savas Manikos as an academic has
Hold
been
on.
on my mind.
Oh, was that Cat Stevens?
It's
Sorry, another
been
song
on
started. There you go. Go.
the killing of Savas Manikos has been on my mind as an academic for the best part of the last 27 years. And I wanted to write something about him because when I was a child, I used to hear this story because my mother is from Lefkonigon. And when my parents married, my father moved there and with my godfather, he had a bus service. And every morning he used to take Savas Menigos to work in Famagusta. So I would always hear this tale more or less every Christmas around the dinner table late at night, where all the people from the family in the village would gather and retell the stories of how this man was killed. And it kind of shocked me to hear this story of how he was tied to a eucalyptus tree and brutally beaten and stoned to death by a group which included, as Andrikos said, quite a lot of children who were encouraged by their teacher and by the village priest to do this very heinous act. And I realized that, and I consulted on this with a very well-known Cypriot anthropologist who sadly passed away, called Peter Loizos, who wrote an amazing book called The Greek Gift. And in my discussions with Professor Loizos, I kind of like decided not to do the research I was planning on doing. It's a bit of a strange way of going about things, I guess. And then some years later, around about 4 years ago, I had this idea of the eucalyptus tree. It was haunting me. And I started writing a song that was a little bit different because quite a lot of my stuff is reggae based or dub poetry based. But this song is more bluesy and it's more spoken word. And I found the act of writing the song, based on the research that I had done, to be quite liberating for me. You know, it felt like writing 15 articles. So I was quite pleased about how although it did actually take quite a few years to get it into the shape it is now. I've changed the lyrics about 3 times. And during the course of doing the research with Andrikos, I've also changed the lyrics again, because a lot of the historical, there's a lot of historical inaccuracy about what happened. And through a lot of the colonial archives that Andrikos found, I was able to get a much better picture of what was going on. So I guess it's a bit strange starting this presentation off with a song. But I'm a firm believer that creative work can have this a sense of enabling us to understand and get over trauma, because this was a very traumatic event. And most of those people in the village of that generation, whether they witnessed the murder or not, don't really want to talk about it. I think I'll leave it there until it calls.
Thanks, mate. Okay, so if this wants to move for me, yes. All right, so we're going to get stuck into the substantive, I suppose, presentation or paper. So just a bit of a synopsis. The Cyprus Emergency, which is how the British call the period between 1955 and 59, or the Aoka struggle, which is what Greek Cypriots would call it, had the aim to achieve enosis, the union of Cyprus with Greece, not independence, which is what Cyprus got in the end. That's another story. You can ask me if you want, but Aoka during this period killed more Greek Cypriots than British and Turkish Cypriots put together. And that's a question that hasn't really been answered before. The main targets were branded as traitors. Basically, they just said they were a traitor, and that was it. We got rid of them. Now, we need to break this down a little bit. There were folks who were working for the police/security forces. There were others that I could probably insert in there to say that there were people who gave information quite innocently to the authorities, and then they became targets as well. So we need to separate that. And then we have political traitors. Of course, they don't call them political traitors, and they deny that there was any ideology involved, but we will show you that there was. Now, breaking the political traitors down into Anglophiles, self-explanatory, I think. Aoka or ex-Aoka figures, who for some reason they removed, they killed, and leftists who belonged to the Communist Party, which we know as AGEL. As I say here, leftists belonged to AGEL, and PEO, which was the left-wing trade union, which was very active during this period, as we will see. Now, Aoka targeted leftists because, one, to stop them from having a role in the enosis struggle. AGEL supported enosis. That might seem really weird, given that in the Greek Civil War, the communists lost. Greece was a right-wing dictatorship, basically, or certainly a precariously flawed democracy during this period. Yet it still supported enosis, which we'll come back to. What it didn't support was the armed struggle. And from growing as a party, as a movement, and playing an important role in political and social life in Cyprus. So the literature review, little has been published in the primary and secondary sources on Aoka political executions. Primary sources, we have the memoirs of the leader of Aoka, who was Colonel George Grievous, whose memoirs were published in English in 1964. He states in his memoirs that he ordered the execution of a few leftists, which is obviously underestimating what he had done. Very obviously, there were at least over 100, probably 150 who were murdered. He also talks about his disputes with the political leader of Aoka, Archbishop Makarios, over Grievous wanting to kill leftists. Makarios disagreed with this, but Grievous just went ahead and did it anyway. And then the other primary source is Serafim Loizou, who's a woman, Elenitsa, that's it, Elenitsa Serafim Loizou, who was one of the very few women who had a prominent role in Aoka. She claimed that in the specific case of Menikos, that he was an informer, which is utterly untrue. There's no evidence for that, not even in the rumors really for that. Now, the secondary sources, we've got Purcell and Crawshaw early on. They were journalists. They mentioned the murder of Menikos, although they spelled his name incorrectly. Purcell referred to it as sadism, and Crawshaw referred to it by quoting the coroner's report, which we'll get to. More recently, we have Rob Holland and Heinz Richter. They mentioned the killing of Menikos and of other leftists, but don't go into a great deal of detail. We have Boumburis in Greek, he was the first to actually try to do a fuller factual account. He used newspapers, leaflets, and interviews. He couldn't use any official archival material. He was a Beo member and a Nagel member of parliament. He identified 18 Eorka murders of leftists. He questioned the Eorka version of Menikos's death from a heart attack, which is what they said. He died of a heart attack. And it was repeated by the Eorka area commander, Fotis Papafotis, who maybe later Haji Mike can comment on this, but in the song, when you're saying liar, liar, I've interpreted that to mean Fotis Papafotis, but I could be wrong, but you can come back to that later, who ordered basically that Menikos be punished, and we'll come back to that. More recently, we have David French, the eminent military historian, who gifted us with his book on Cyprus, Menikos and Iakoumis, who was also murdered that same night as Menikos. He claimed that these were the two most horrific of the murders. On Menikos, he quoted Sophie Foot, who was the governor of Cyprus at the time, his report to the Colonial Office, and mentioned the protests that occurred as a result of Menikos's murder and Iakoumis, which included the wives of the two men. There were public protests because there was a 48-hour strike that followed. And then we have Michael's work, Michael's chapter in Greek. He built on Boumboudis' earlier work and his approach. He increased the number to 30, but doesn't add a great deal more on Menikos. Now it's over to you, Mike, for the fictional accounts.
Yeah, the fictional accounts on the murder of Savvas Menikos, in many ways, there was a lot of prose and poetry, which came out shortly afterwards, late 50s, early 60s. There is quite a lot of poetry. It's something we didn't really look at because we both felt that, analysis of poetry is very different from short stories and novels. It is something that we plan to look at in the future. The most substantive of the fictional accounts shortly after that period, because there was a kind of taboo about talking about this murder publicly and writing about it, was by Pieridis in a series of short stories called, I think, Skliri Geri, which means hard times. And he's got a short story in there that I came across basically through my father-in-law, who knew him, called Auto da Fe in 1963. Pieridis was a writer and librarian at the Nicosia Municipal Library, and he's he's an acclaimed writer in Cyprus, especially in the short story genre. He didn't really mention the name Menikos. It's all fictionalized, and he also refers to a big village in the region of Messaouria, which is the flat plain between Nicosia and Famagusta. But it's very clear what he's talking about, and it is a fictionalized account of the killing. The title Auto da Fe actually is quite intellectual, in his time, and I guess I would assume a lot of people didn't actually know what it meant or where it came from. But it has to do with the execution of apostates during the Inquisitions. And it's an allegorical story, which in a way was a resistance to the official narrative of Eoga. And that narrative is something that Andrikos in his own work has called Eoga Eogadokratia. I'm sorry, it's a little bit late at night here. So, and then we go to another piece of work, which is in 2017 by Achniotis, called Idili, which means the cowards. This is in Greek. I'm not really sure how to. I mean, we say here it's a novel, but it's not really a novel. It's a series of accounts that he brings together based on research and also based on his own kind of historical fictionalization of the lynching of Menigos, who he sees as a working class hero by masked men and followers of Eoga. And he makes it very clear in the work that the murder of Menigos is an ethical dilemma, and that ethical dilemma focuses on the theme of cowardice and how people who took part in it, how they had to live with it for many decades afterwards. Can we go to the next slide?
Yes. So this is that you or me now?
I think it's me.
Go.
Yeah. So what we aim to do in this research is to fill a gap in the history of Eoga, and to write about Eoga from a critical perspective. And part of that is a revision of the context behind the execution of leftists by elements of Eoga that are the extreme right of Eoga. And Andrikos mentioned earlier that Grivas was the leader of Eoga. He was the leader of the military wing of Eoga. Makarios really was seen more as the populist leader of Eoga. And the British exiled him in Seychelles for a large part of the Eoga campaign. We also want to look at the views and role of the colonial accounts of these deaths, and that's something that Andrikos has focused on a lot through uncovering a lot of official archives, and I must commend him for that, because a lot of these archives were under 50 years, 100 years seals by the British state, and he requested that they be opened. And this is the first time that some of these files have been looked at by a historian. And one of the things that I was more interested in, because I've got more of a media background as an academic, was the role of the media in public perception. And I went through all the newspapers during that time frame from the time of his death on the 23rd of May to roughly in 1958 to roughly the second week of June, when things took a different turn, which we'll probably refer to later, because there was a lot more ethnic conflict between the communities, the Greek and Turkish Cypriots. And also it's important for us to look at the role of fiction in the murder of Menigos, which hasn't been looked at before, and to actually put all these works together and try and unpack what they mean. And one of the key things that we both agreed on from the start, that this was a mob killing, and we don't mean the mafia, we mean roughly about 200 people took part in this killing, and that made it a very heinous crime, but also made it a very unique act during that phase. It's the only example of a mob killing led by Eoga, and it was the only one that we've come across that involved children. And do I carry on, Enrico? I think I do, yeah?
Yep.
Or you do? Methodology is complicated because there's different kinds of methodologies here. The exploration of the history, the historical element of far-right violence in Cyprus and its origins and the nature of EOGA is very meticulously explained by Andrikos. We mainly use colonial archives and newspapers, and we explored the scale and method of EOGA executions, why leftists were targeted from the late 1957, and why Lefkonigon as well, which is quite a significant point, because Lefkonigon has got a kind of history of resistance to colonialism, I would say, but it's usually resistance of the right-wing resistance. And in many ways, it's no surprise that the mob killed Manikos in the way it did because of that background. We're very interested in unpacking the official story and what actually happened, and the role of the colonial state in this, especially the documents from the colonial state. The coroner's report, for instance, played a very important role in this case, and it hasn't really been looked at before. And nobody has actually used the methodology of analyzing media content from the point of view of how this very public sphere was very polarized between left and right, highly politicized, but also the way that politicization, the way different newspapers tried to set different agendas. So one of the methodologies I looked at was agenda setting, but in a very, because usually we associate agenda setting with, somebody's trying to tell you what to think. And that is usually a dominant ideology. But in this context, we found that there was different agendas being set for different reasons. And also looking at the fictionalized accounts required its own methodology of textual narrative analysis and the context and what that would reveal about the murder of Savvas Manikos. Over to you, Andrikos.
Okay, the theoretical framework. So we used various theories, but for our overarching focus, we looked at the sociological literature on mob political killings. So we've got Grановita argued that there was a threshold at which individuals, even those otherwise non-violent, join the mob. Suppose we could include first-timers here as well. Kinetti, the mob wants to grow and eliminate difference. So this was interesting to us and applicable. Le Bon and later Zimbardo showed how the anonymity of a mob helped to explain why ordinary villagers participated in mob killings. We go back to Polybius, claimed that the ochlocracy thrived where order collapsed. So in Cyprus during the EOKA campaign, we see order contested from various sides, including between the right and the left within the Greek Cypriot community, which is very much forgotten. It's the conflict is always sort of focused around Greek Cypriots, the British, while also there is a Greek and Turkish Cypriot conflict emerging. We don't see a lot about the conflict within the Greek Cypriot community. George Roudet posited that mobs were organized entities influenced by social and political ideologies. The murder of Manikos was a symbolic act emanating from the far right against the left. And finally, Turner and Killian showed how such behavioral norms formed under, does that say, oops, and the intense social and political conditions that made violence acceptable, even expected, as we will see. Although it is unique, it's not the only political killing. So now I get into the historical sort of background. Enosis between the far right and the far left. As a political demand, enosis originated in the first decade of the 1900s. There are two pathways that emerge. One is the longer, peaceful pathway in which they hope to convince the Turkish Cypriots and the British to accept enosis and be okay with it. Sometimes they're called the moderates. And then the second pathway, the more militant one, pushing the British, defying the Turkish Cypriots, and attacking Greek Cypriots who don't support this method, who support the other method. Now, it's important to note, in 1929, we have the formation of a far right-wing political party known as EREK, formed by the Bishop of Kyrenia. There are 4 bishops in Cyprus. Kyrenia is just north of Nicosia. His name was Makarios. And Savas Loizidis, a journalist, lawyer figure. They were inspired by Nazism and fascism more generally, and they were willing to use violence to achieve enosis and to get rid of traitors. In 1931, Government House, where the governor lived, was burnt down after a pro-enosis demonstration had attempted to capitalize on the economic downturn, which had led to a great deal of people being upset and demonstrating. The government immediately began to deport various political figures, including the leaders of EREK, who made their way to Athens, and in 1934 orchestrated the assassination of Antonios Triantafyllidis, who supported enosis with British support. I'm just going to pass around my book, last book, which is on this subject. And it's there that I introduce, I think, the term eokatokratia, which Mike referred to before, and I should explain. It's a play on the word Turkokratia, if you've ever heard of this word, which simply means held by the Turks during the period of Ottoman rule, where I'm playing with the word by saying, well, EOKA is holding Cyprus hostage during this period and into the Republic period, and even today, where you can't speak negatively about EOKA in Cyprus, or it's hard to do so. Now, we need to also now talk about AGEL, which is the Communist Party. Now, AGEL was formed in 1941. There had been a previous Communist Party, which they supplanted, the CPC, Communist Party of Cyprus. They had a different position. Their position, the earlier party, was independence within a Balkan confederation, not enosis. They in fact disparaged enosis as an idea. AGEL comes along and supplants them and adopts enosis as the ultimate goal, initially through a stepping stone of self-government. They accept self-government first and then enosis. But then, as we see there in 1948, they adopt enosis and only enosis, which is the catchphrase of the far right. Nothing in between. I should have mentioned that up here in 1931, the British suspended the constitution, so there was no more representative institutions. In 46 and 47, the British rehabilitate the far right. The EREK leaders are allowed to return. And we also see the formation of Organization X in Cyprus. Now, Organization X, or if you like, Organization He, was one of these paramilitary groups operating in wartime Greece. It was a far right-wing group which had connections to the occupying whatever regime, and then fought the communists in the civil war. Now, the leader of Organization He was none other than Colonel George Grievous. So we'll come to him in a second. Now, here we have the election of Leontios as Archbishop. There was no Archbishop for 13 odd years. He then died mysteriously after 40 days. It's in that book. Talk about it in the book. Then we have Makarios II elected. He is none other than the Makarios from up here, the one who orchestrated the assassination of Triantafyllidis. Basically, the far right is in the ascent, and they have stemmed the rise of AGEL, because in this period, AGEL had 4 mayors elected. They were the only representative element. Hence, AGEL shifting to the right, adopting enosis and only enosis. Then in 1951, we have a new archbishop, Makarios III. He then forms EOKA in Athens at the suggestion of none other, there's a key name missing here. Obviously, I know the name. Savas Loizidis. So we go back to up here. Same guy. So there is this continuity between Erek and the formation of EOKA. And they call on Grievous to lead the military wing of EOKA, as Mike said. EOKA deployed sabotage, rural and urban guerrilla warfare, and assassinations. It was totally modeled on organization here, with a focus on recruiting youths. Youths were how they were going to go about doing a lot of these acts. The Enosis struggle was romanticized as another Greek struggle, with many, many references in their leaflets to the Greek War of Independence from the 1820s. So it's very much, it's not an anti-colonial thing. It's very much a 19th century romantic nationalism as an irredentist imperialism aimed at creating a greater Greece. Haji Dimitriou, who was a political figure as well as a historian. Cyprus was a colony that sought its freedom during the era of anti-colonial struggles. However, the leadership never wanted to admit that the Cyprus issue was part of the broader anti-colonial problem. EOKA, Enosis, if you like, was closer, in my view, to Jewish Zionism than third world anti-colonial movements or national liberation struggles. They were both imperialist. They both aimed to supplant one colonialism, a British one, with another one. Okay. EOKA strongly was anti-communist. Enosis was a right-wing anti-communist Greek, communist Greece. That's what they wanted, anti-communist Greece. Keep Agel away from leading the Enosis struggle and keep Agel out of Cypriot political life. So this wasn't just about Enosis. The executions. So the executions before and after Menikos. So the EOKA campaign started on the 1st of April, 1955. The first 2 years focused on sabotage, targeted assassinations of British and Cypriot security personnel, and on civil disobedience. There was intimidation and execution of traitors, but this was a secondary focus, or third, whatever, focus. The first wave of political execution started in February of 1956 and ended in January of 57. During this period, there were a total of 54 that I've come across. And basically, the work involved a laborious sort of search of newspapers, almost day by day. Mostly, these people who were killed were Anglophiles. So they decided at the beginning, let's get rid of those who are pro-British. And other critics of EOKA. There were some who belonged to the left. Then we have a break and the murders continue, or recommence if you like, from September of 57, and they go all the way to the end of October of 58. And these murders are more focused on leftists. And I've been able to identify 97 in total. So for both phases, we're talking about over 150. Now, there were others who were killed outside of these phases, as well. And needless to say, we can't talk about those who were brutally beaten up or shot and wounded and were whatever disabled as a result, is what I want to say. Now, Agel and Beor, revived from mid-1957 under the leadership of Andreas Chartidis, pushing for the right wing to abandon armed struggle, which they never were going to do, and to unite with the left to push for Enosis together. Agel's Enosis was more in line with anti-colonial, but not entirely. I need to still develop this Anyway, the aim was to include, they wanted to be included in negotiations with the British. They accepted Makarios as the political leader, but they wanted a seat at the table, is basically what this is about. Now, the targeting of traitors and leftists. Michael's chapter claimed that there were 30 leftists who were murdered, but research has shown, as I've said, probably 150. Most involved masked men entering the coffee shop or the coffee house, which we call cafenio, in the evening and shooting their victims. Menikos was not the only case that did not fit this model and was not the only sadistic one either. We have the one that was killed that evening as well, Yakumis, who had his eyes shot out. And we have the case of Panayotis Stylianou, who is, I think his name is Arkobanos, his sort of nickname. And he was murdered 6 days later with using planks of wood with nails on them, and they beat him in this way. But again, no mob. The only case of the mob is Menikos. Most were planned. They were not, if you like, spontaneous. We need to look also at the fact that, following on from what I said about them being planned, on 8th of October 1957, Michael Ashodis, who was the leading EOKA guerrilla, surrendered to the British, that is, and he handed in a list of names, 200 in total, which included his own, hence his wanting to surrender, in which Grievous planned to execute these people. It was an execution list. Most of these people were EOKA people that came under some form of suspicion, but not all of them were. Many of them were not, and some of them were leftists. Next, EOKA justified the execution of leftists, specifically now, in a 26-page book. I should have brought the booklet. What an idiot. Anyway, the 26-page booklet published in Athens in July of 58. Obviously, they didn't conduct the research in July, publish it and whatnot. It was a longer-term process to do that. It was titled The Communist Leadership and the Cypriot Struggle. The British called it the Black Book. Governor Foote advised London that such a book would be published in February of 58, that is. Its content was finalized in March. It listed the names of over 100 leftists deemed to have been traitors. Basically, it was all based on hearsay. So-and-so said, we heard this about this person and therefore they're, you know. Now, many were subsequently executed. The British would always say, this person was listed in the Black Book. So based on gossip. Now, Menikos was not in this book. He was not listed. What he did to upset them happened after. Now, this is a photo of Andreas Chartidis. It's very unusual because Chartidis was not the leader of AGEL. He was the head of BEO, the trade union. What had occurred was AGEL had been proscribed and leaders imprisoned. Chartidis left just before they were imprisoned. EOKA claimed that he had been tipped off and that he was an agent for the British and whatnot. Anyway, he came back to Cyprus in whatever, April, May of 57. And the leader of AGEL, who escaped custody, the British decided not to rearrest because he was unwell in health. And basically, he became the de facto, I think we can say this, the de facto leader of AGEL in some respects. He's the prominent figure here. This is a picture of the book that I mentioned, the communist leadership against Cypriot struggle. So EOKA targeted leftists because Grievous and EOKA were anti-communist and they were angered by the popularity of AGEL and BEO. AGEL had criticized EOKA. It had been communists from behind the Iron Curtain that had exposed Grievous as the leader of EOKA, because when EOKA first started its activities, he went around with a non-deployed. He still did, even later when people knew who he was. He still signed the Yenis. I've already mentioned the arrest of the leaders and Ziartidis' escape and his return, and the fact that Ezekias Papaioannou was ill. The left pursued a strategy of unity with the right. They acknowledged Makarios as the leader of the Greek Cypriots, but demanded that the left be recognized and included in negotiations with the British. They demanded that the British allow Makarios to return and they wanted the emergency ended, and they wanted their ban lifted. They continued to oppose the armed struggle, but support Enosis as the ultimate goal. This does not go down well with Grievous. He doesn't want Agel or Beo involved in any of the political life in Cyprus. He doesn't care that they acknowledge Makarios. He doesn't care that they support Enosis. He wants to suppress communism, and he doesn't want them to play any role in the Enosis struggle. He tries to force Beo members to join SEC. What happens is there's left-wing unions and there are right-wing unions. Obviously, the left-wing unions are much more popular, and they're sometimes referred to as the old unions, and the right-wing ones are sometimes referred to as the new ones. How does the left react to all of these political killings? The left does not return fire. It claims that this would start a civil war. Instead, it demands that it be stopped, claims that these people, they are not traitors, but just leftists who are opposed to the armed struggle. And they organize national strikes and mass rallies against what they're referring to as the masked men. I mentioned, right, that it was masked men who would enter the coffee houses. After the murders of Elias Tofaris, a PO member from Komatu Yalu, which is also in Famagusta, a lot of the murders occurred in the Famagusta district. And Michael Petru, who was the secretary of the Lisi branch of the Building Workers and General Workers Trade Union, on the night of the 21st of January of 58, their wives publicly appealed for such murders to stop so other women would not be left unprotected. Agel and Beo instructed members to only retaliate in self-defense and try to expose the masked men, that is, by lifting their masks, which also angered Grievous. Now, Grievous is also angered by the clear popularity of the left through being able to organize these popular demonstrations. Now, let's go briefly to Lefkoniko, the scene of the crime. Why did the mob killing of Savas Menikos happen in Lefkoniko? Lefkoniko was a large township. Around 2,500 people were counted in the 1946 census. It had a history of left-right tension, usually created by the right, which predates even 1946 and 47. And I say that because that's before organization here is established in Cyprus. We go to 25th of March, 1945. There are celebrations for Greek Independence Day, ended in bloodshed after a speech by the schoolmaster angered far right-wing figures who tried to assault him, and the police became involved, and unfortunately I'm not sure if they were innocent bystanders, but they were not the headmaster or schoolmaster, were killed. So a very severe incident. Several incidents occurred during the EOKA period at Lefkoniko. On the 3rd of October of 55, the EOKA number 2, Grigoris Avxendiou, raided the police station and stole arms. He couldn't have done it without local help. 3rd of December of 55, EOKA burned down the post office, resulting in a collective village fine, which included the Turkish Cypriots, by the way. So again, could not have happened without local help. 23rd of October of 56, schoolboys who potentially were involved in Menikos's murder, detonated a bomb at the water fountain where British soldiers were going would go to after playing soccer, football, killing 2 soldiers. Menikos was not the first or the last to be executed in Lefkoniko. We have the case of Pieris Pistolas, beaten to death outside his home on the 4th of December of 57. The Black Book listed many from Lefkoniko that EOKA wanted to execute. Example, Yorios Polytechnis, who was executed on the 8th of August of 58. So they continue even after Menikos. As I said, Menikos was not mentioned in the Black Book because his, I think, indiscretion, or we think his indiscretion happened after the research had been completed. Now, the official colonial record on his execution, Governor Foote and other colonial authorities were shocked by the brutality. Foote called it disgustingly brutal. He advised London about the right-left tensions and the left-wing strikes and anger, which he claimed was felt more widely by Greek Cypriots, not just the left, since the events of the week had provided ample indications of Eorka's determination to allow only the extremist nationalist voice to be audible above the cracks of pistol shots and the screams of dying traitors. Foote believed that witnesses would come forward to provide information to prosecute, but the investigation stalled as witnesses were too afraid to come forward. Basically, there was a roundup. They went to the village, the township, and they just basically spent days there forcing people to go in and to provide testimony. It didn't work. The post-mortem was done by Dr. Necip Sanurkan. He found an otherwise healthy man, this is Menikos, beaten to a pulp, who had died from the shock and respiratory failure resulting from the injuries described. So this is where Eorka flips this and claims that he died of a heart attack. Of course he did. Because he was beaten to a pulp. British wanted a quick inquest to have the post-mortem published, and they wanted to use the brutal murder as part of their sort of campaign in the European Court of Human Rights, where the Greek and British governments were accusing each other of violations of human rights in Cyprus. I can talk more in questions if people are interested. The British did not pursue the case because it was not a priority and soon had to focus on the outbreak of violence between the Greek and Turkish Cypriot communities in early June and proposals to end the emergency, the so-called Macmillan Plan, Macmillan being the Prime Minister of Great Britain. The inquest was from the 9th to the 13th of June before Justice James P. Traynor. He said that in his 25 years involved in the law, he had never seen anything that approached, and I quote, the savagery and brutality of this case. He went on, one would not hear of a more disgraceful piece of brutality from the depths of the darkest jungle. And it does not matter who this man was or what he was, there was no justification for such treatment. Such behavior is sheer animalism. The verdict was that Menikos was killed, not died by accident because he was tied to a tree, as Eorka says, but killed in Lefkoniko on the 23rd of May by unknown persons. Before leaving the bench, and this is mentioning it now because we're going to come back to it, Traynor criticized a newspaper for sending a reporter to interview villagers and publishing an article discussing the cause of death based on these interviews. The editor knew that the inquest was going to happen, so it was, and I quote, a disgraceful thing for such a person to anticipate the verdict. Okay, one more from me, I think, before we go to Mike. Now, the public sphere, the leaflets, these were mainly found through the colonial records that the British had and translated. Immediately after, Agel and Beo attacked Eorka, not attacked physically, attacked in the leaflets, Eorka for its murder of Menikos and other leftists. Beo, the murder of Menikos reminded us, and I quote, of the darkest days of the history of mankind, sort of echoing the coroner there, referred to the murderers as fanatics who humiliated Menikos and had no pity on his crying wife, who there are different stories here. The initial reports were that his wife was there for part of it at least before he died. Later, when it came time to testify, she claimed she wasn't there until he had already died. Probably she was too scared to speak out. They had no respect for the holy place in which it occurred. The eucalyptus tree was in the churchyard. They had, and I quote, wounded our national civilization and undermined the moral foundations of the national struggle. Agel, the political murders against leftists were horrible political crimes that roused the conscience of every Cypriot patriot and civilized man. What did Eorka say? And Beka, which was the political wing, response was one of defiance, denial, and deflection. It told people to not listen to these leftists trying to divide the people because those murdered were traitors. It tried to paint Menikos as a criminal as well as a traitor, and that he was not killed because he was a leftist. An EOKA leaflet on the 6th of June claimed that Menikos was not stoned and that he had merely died of a heart attack while being tied to the tree. They referred to him having been beaten, that he had beaten, sorry. So this, we're going to come back to this. They claimed that he had previously come across some children who were shouting pro-EOKA slogans, and he had beaten them and threatened to expose EOKA members. Mike, we are finally over to you for the newspapers.
Yes. The newspapers, as part of the public sphere, using an approach which combines agenda setting with thematic analysis. There was significant reporting based on inclusions and exclusions. You know, certain newspapers included certain things, but they excluded others, and vice versa. And this was characterized by the ideological and political divide, and also, I would say, aesthetic differences between newspapers. You know, some newspapers were also in Greek, some were in English, some were, you know, trying to be a bit more, they would say, objective. I'm not so sure if newspapers can ever be objective, but it's a different story. We found 64 articles on Menikos from the 24th of May to the 15th of June. As I said earlier, after the 15th of June, following an incident in Gonyeli, where a group of Greek Cypriots were killed by Turkish Cypriot nationalists, the whole narrative changed about the barbarianism of EOKA against leftists, and it became the conflict between Greek and Turkish Cypriots, at least in the newspapers. So Menikos was seldom mentioned after that, and possibly only in one of the newspapers, Haravyi, which is the communist newspaper. As I said, the newspapers in Cyprus are divided ideologically between left and right, and this applies to this right up till now. Haravyi is the organ of Agel, and it reported that Menikos was brutally murdered because he was a leftist, and featured interviews with witnesses, his wife, and his youngest son. The newspaper that Andrikos just mentioned, which was criticized, is actually, Haravyi was one of the newspapers criticized, and also, I think, the Times of Cyprus, which was an English newspaper. And the right-wing newspapers followed the EOKA Bega line. The graph on the previous page, if you can go back, Andrikos, it illustrates the reporting in terms of substantive numbers, and Haravyi had the most articles, and the newspapers that had tended to have less articles were right-wing newspapers. And there's 2 English language newspapers. That doesn't necessarily mean they were pro-British, although I guess the Cyprus Mail is often accused of that. The Times of Cyprus actually had a different kind of copy policy, shall we say. If you can go to the next slide. This is a thematic analysis of the newspapers, which gives you an understanding of the different agendas that were being set, because the murder took place. Many people witnessed it, but then after that there was silence, and also, but there was a lot of reporting in the newspapers. And what the newspapers tended to do was either report it in a way of stressing certain topics, you know, thematically. So a right-wing newspaper like Ethnos, which has in total 7 articles on the murder, doesn't really focus on the murder, doesn't mention the post-mortem, doesn't mention Menegos' funeral, mentions the mass protests, in a very ideologically fueled way, mentions the roundup in the village, mentions the arrest of 27 people, and there's no mention of the inquest findings. Whereas in a newspaper like Haravi, which is a left-wing newspaper, the complete opposite, the murder is mentioned quite a lot. Surprisingly, the post-mortem isn't mentioned, which I found a bit difficult to get to grips with. The funeral is mentioned, the mass protests are mentioned, and they don't really stress the roundup in the village like some of the right-wing newspapers did. And they they also have a very strong emphasis on the left-right conflict, which follows on from what Andrikos said about the left's approach to overcoming these sort of differences. So we can see from these newspapers, in terms of the 10 key thematics that I found in that newspaper coverage, that certain newspapers stress certain themes while other newspapers underestimate them. And there's a very strong emphasis on the detention as well of people from Lefkonikon. And some of those people were also tortured by the British. So the you know, and that included things like waterboarding and Russian roulette. And this is all reported in newspapers. And many of these people arrested, although there were some adults, like the school teacher, quite a large portion of them were quite young. So in these different newspapers, we see different kinds of narratives. In the right-wing newspapers, there's a focus on anti-communism that reports that the Haravi's reporting is completely false, and that Menegos was an informer, and he had not been stoned to death and beaten by nationalists. And this furthers the narrative by Babafodis and Eoga and Bega that he died of a heart attack. The English language newspapers took a different approach. The Cyprus Mail tended to reflect events in a matter-of-fact way, with a higher degree of what I would call journalistic professionalism, while the Times of Cyprus tended to take a more sensationalist approach. These are those things that I call the aesthetic differences. The one criticized by Traynor is in the Times of Cyprus. Charles Foley, the editor, later edited the Grivas memoirs into English, backed Eoga and the right-wing narratives. A reporter conducted interviews of the villagers who had nothing good to say about Menegos. This is one of the things that was reported in the right-wing press.
Is the Times of Cyprus?
Sorry, in the Times of Cyprus. And they branded him a traitor and a criminal. And this is something that you get to hear in people's narratives as well. But there's conflicting narratives. You know, some people say that it was just a hard-working class, you know, person who, you know, who was totally innocent. And then other people say that he provoked young kids who were shouting pro-Eoga slogans, and they had even ripped a Greek flag on the 3rd of March before warning the villagers to stop indoctrinating children. Or as they say, he would expose Eoga. This is very different from narratives that I've heard about him. And this information was new and indicated a personal dimension to the murder. And why the school children were so involved in it and exploited in their involvement because they took part in the killing. It's very interesting that, you know, the newspapers tell completely different stories. The murder of Menegos was fictionalized because, firstly, the dominance of the Eogadokratia controlling the Republic of Cyprus that emerged after independence, in inverted commas, required that fictionalization in a way. You know, it was like it was very difficult to talk about it as fact. Although in the fictionalization there are a lot of facts, and there is a lot of also exaggeration in some of the fictionalized reports. And there were limited skills and sources to actually understand these the non-fictional accounts. The colonial records weren't available till much later. The analysis of newspapers didn't really happen until we've done it, which is many decades later. Pieridis published this short story just before the outbreak of the Civil War in December 1963 in Cyprus, between the different communities. He was a novelist and poet. He was a civil servant and the director of the Nicosia Municipal Library. His short story contained a lot of accurate information, although it was totally fictionalized, and it provides a number of moral lessons about the crime. The mob killing was compared to those killings during the Inquisitions, carried out on the say-so of a fanatical leadership who had indoctrinated the population to facilitate their agenda. And secondly, one of the characters in the book, Trifonas, who witnessed the murder, was haunted by that last gaze of the victim just before he drew his last breath. This represents a form both of resistance to what happened and a sense of guilt for not doing anything, even if there is an isolated, fictionalized individual. And thirdly, the perpetrators were unable to feel their guilt because they were blinded by their fanaticism. And this is made very clear in the pressure they put on the priest who carries out Menigos's funeral service, because Menigos wasn't actually from Lefkonigon. He was from a hamlet nearby called Roufes, which is short distance from Lefkonigon. And this was a mixed village, a mixed hamlet of Greek and Turkish Cypriots. Quite a very small hamlet, and largely working class people or people who works on the land. And I think that blindness is something that perpetuates to this day, because a lot of people still believe that he died of a heart attack. Achnodis produced this fictionalized history, as he calls it, and this was released much later on. When this questioning of the hegemony of Eoga in some ways has been weakened, it's been challenged a lot more in contemporary Cyprus. And his overarching theme is the theme of cowardice of the perpetrators for their acts. And it's quite moralistic in terms of how he sort of unpacks and looks at various syllogisms about what people did from different perspectives. This is quite an interesting thing in the book, really. It's the most interesting thing that I found. And this counters the narrative of Eoga's heroes and their subsequent denial of their actions. He refers to the societal protest. There's a very long introduction in Achnodis' book, which kind of like contextualizes his book. And in 2017, there was a protest when a group of people symbolically overnight renamed streets in Nicosia. So Grivas Digenis Avenue, which is the partly fictionalized name of Yorgos Grivas, was renamed to Savas Menigos Avenue for one night. These signs were taken down, obviously, by the police afterwards. But I would say that resistance is quite an interesting societal phenomena, and Achnodis is part of that revisionism in many ways.
Thanks,
go to the
Mike.
next- Yeah.
So it's me now, the conclusion. So performative ethnography, the story told and retold over many family gatherings for Mike overhearing, his father overhearing the meeting with Baba Fortis, that's critical. The admittance of letting the mob loose is important here. The murder of Menikos was part of the wider story of far-right intimidation and executions that predate Eoka even. Of course, they take on a life of their own during the Eoka period. Targeted people opposed to the far-right pathway to Enosis and leftists. This was expanded under Eoka to include those opposed to an armed struggle. Eoka was responsible for over 150 political murders, while the favored method was for masked men to shoot victims in the Cafeneo. The murder of Menikos was completely different. A mob in public using brutal methods of beating and stoning. The motivations combined political and personal hatred, with the unusual feature being the pivotal role played by children. By May of 58, Eoka violence went beyond die-hard members to ordinary people, even to children. The mob represented Eoka control over Enosis and over Cyprus to create a right-wing polity that would unite to a right-wing Greece. Understanding political murders from 55 to 59 will better place Cyprus to heal from a violent past that goes beyond the Greek and Turkish Cypriot conflict, which we haven't really touched upon. Thanks, and sorry we went a little over time.
That was really, really interesting and a fascinating way in which you wove together different kinds of approaches. Can I invite questions? Please.
I would be interested to know a bit more about the British and the Greeks arguing over human rights.
Yes. So what happened there was Greece first took Britain to the European Court of Human Rights over their use of torture in Cyprus. And within Cyprus, Eoka created committees. David French's book talks about this, but also there's a massive book. It's that big. Simpson is the name, who has several chapters on Cyprus. The British countered by saying, well, look at Eoka, look at what Eoka's doing. They're just shooting people left and indiscriminately, British army personnel, security personnel. There was also murder of civilians. There was the infamous murder of a woman, Cutliff, as well, which they went berserk over. So it was this back and forth situation, which in the case of Menikos and the other murders that occurred around that time, the British were trying to capitalize on these by taking it to the Euro and saying, look, they're accusing us, but look at their brutal methods. So on the one hand, they drop the investigation, so to speak, after the inquest because of the broader crisis, the intercommunal, if you like, or the civil war fighting between Greek and Turkish Cypriots, and because they're trying to find a resolution through the Macmillan Plan, but also because they're trying to use this in the European Court of Human Rights.
Other questions, please?
Thank you so much for that. It's really comprehensive. Yeah, a lot of stuff to think about. I'm wondering what was the relationship to what was happening in Cyprus to the political situation in Greece, and what kind of relationships maybe between these groups in Cyprus to Greek politics?
Well, Eoka was formed, as I said, in Greece. When it was formed, there were Greeks who were part of Eoka from the very beginning. So you had your exiles who could have gone back to Cyprus, but some of them chose to stay on in Greece, like Savas Loizidis and his brother too. Whatever his name was, doesn't matter. But there were also Greek army personnel who were part of EOKA right from the beginning. Clearly people who were close to Grievous, and they stayed part of it. Now, the Greek government eventually, after it took Cyprus to the UN for self-determination, it has direct links with EOKA. The foreign minister, for example, Averov, he would write to Grievous. The Greeks provided arms to EOKA. Of course, all secretly brought into Cyprus, smuggled in, but there were direct links. Now, Greece was, as other Western European countries, trying to stop communism from coming to power. But in Greece, it takes a sort of more extreme dimension because of the civil war. So communists are shut out of politics, but there is a left-wing party that emerges during this period as well. But yeah, there are direct links between the government and the military and EOKA. And when Makarios Makarios was exiled in March of 56 to the Seychelles Islands for about a year. He then is released under Macmillan, but is not allowed to return to Cyprus. So he lives in Athens for the remainder of the conflict, where he is, of course, immersed within that politics.
Can I ask, I'm going to shamelessly exploit my position as chair here to ask a question. Can I ask a question about the interaction between the creative element and the research element of this project?
Yeah.
So you started off with really powerful performance, and you mentioned, Mike, I think mentioned that that the research had influenced the music. I'm wondering to what how to what extent that's occurred, whether the music has also influenced or the creative process has influenced the research. Could you guys reflect on that a little bit?
Yeah, I'll let Mike answer. I'll just say one thing. I'll just say that Mike had already produced the song as part of an album before we caught up in whatever it was, April of last year, and we did this fantastic radio show. He's on Cat Stevens, but we also talked about this and how whether we should do something on this. And I was going to London, and so he already had the song, and I had heard the song, and then it became really about his process. It mostly, I think, yeah, he can speak about that, how it changed the song.
Yeah, I mean, I actually recorded this song in Jamaica. So it was part of my last release called Acoustic Poetry. And I'd written the song, and that recording is quite different from the way I sing it now. It's similar in many ways, but some of the lyrics have changed. And some of that has changed mainly through the research that I've done with Andrikos. But also there's a lot of changes to it from a singing point of view. And I've changed the structure of the song slightly, mainly because I felt much more comfortable the way I do it now. Because songwriting for me is a process of revision. I could take 20 years to write a song and be happy with it. Doesn't always happen like that, but I like to revise things, and sometimes even change the chords, change the way things are done, in terms of how songs are delivered.
Can you confirm, Mike, that the last bit where you say liar, liar, is that in reference to Papafodis?
It's referencing to Papafodis, but it's referencing
the
whole hegemony of EOKA on his death. The fact that people still tell me that he died of a heart attack, and that he wasn't stoned to death, makes them liars. It's misinformation. There are, there is quite a lot of literature on performative creative acts and as processes of working your way through trauma. Because personally, when I heard this story, I was hearing this story from about the age of 6, you know, and I started to understand it more when I was about 10. So it really, you know, imagine a 10-year-old hearing stories about people being stoned, someone being stoned to death, tied with barbed wire to a eucalyptus tree. You know, it freaked me out a little bit. You know, I thought this is totally inhumane. You know, and I was trying to work out exactly what happened. But I would always hear these different accounts, even around the dinner table, people would say different things. And there will be quite a lot of exaggeration as well. There'll be the priest pissed on him while he was being beaten, you know, and certain journalists have said this as well. But there isn't actually proof that that happened. The priest was there though, and it was done with his blessing. He didn't tell them to stop beating Menikos. So I just found writing about it as a song to be quite liberating for me, rather than writing an academic article, which is what I wanted to do in the beginning.
Sure.
And as I was doing it, I linked with Andrikos, who was in Cyprus to promote his book on the political killing of Triantafyllides in the 30s. And I was really impressed with his work. I always have been. And we said when we was doing this radio interview that it would be really good to look at this as a case study, to try and unravel it, because he really liked the song that I've written. And you know, I do see the song as an act of resistance, and I think it's important that it is performed and the story is told, because you know, one of the things that I believe in as a songwriter is to tell untold stories.
Well, it's certainly a very powerful story, and I think a really interesting performance and pay.
Thank you.
We've come to the end of our session, so please join me in thanking Mike and very.
Thank you.
Thanks, Mike.
Thanks a lot, man.
All right,
It was,
we'll let you go and get some
maybe.
sleep.
Yeah, I need it. It's 1:30.
Yeah, yeah.
Kalinishka, and thanks for the support with all the technical stuff for the people there, and thanks for the conference.
I'll get
Thank
the
you.
USB actually.
Okay, so I will stop the recording.